Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is the first Infinity K tutorial. This one was requested by Basanova. Nice name. I enjoy that. And this is what I got. And here's the original, which is Stomp by Getter. I didn't nail the pattern or anything, but I also didn't really nail the sound either, but I got pretty close. I have the more or less the sort of the underlying business or whatever. Before I get in to show you how to do this, let me explain what's going on. The Infinity K tutorials are like the old 40K, 75K kind of things where I'm taking sound design requests. If you would like to make a request, comment in this video. And by this video, I mean whatever the current Infinity K video is. So far, I have the Infinity K announcement video, and I have this video, the first video for the Infinity K. I will only be taking ideas for sounds that I'm going to create from whatever the most current Infinity K video is. At the moment, that happens to be this video, but when I have number 2 come out, that's going to be that video. And number 3 come out, it's going to be that video. That's where I'm going to get my sources. I used to use a Reddit thread, but there was a lot of logistic issues with that. And I figure, just go back and doing comments. I'll figure it out. It'll be great. Yeah, I feel like I wanted to say something else. Oh yeah, requests made anywhere else will be ignored. Full stop. Yeah, so let's start talking about this sound. So, this is what I got going on, and I did this with Massive. And I actually learned quite a bit about Massive in my attempts to create the sound. And actually, I can feel there's already plenty of you who are watching this right now that already know how to make the sound and already know that it's not that deep. However, my attempts to do it was a bit much just because I don't know a whole lot about Massive. I know enough about it because I know what a filter is and that kind of thing. I know all the individual components, but I'm not a very big, I don't know enough about what the individual tables sound like to know what they sound like in layers and that kind of thing. However, this particular one that was the beginning of this sound, the AI filter, I just recognized that right off the bat in the original sound because it's really kind of plain. Although it's possible, if you look at the Edison here, it's possible that when that AI is really noticeable, right here, right there. Oh boy, that was some super going on in there, but that wasn't present in the beginning. And there's some, you can see a similar sort of positions of modulation going on there, but suddenly this is here, and it isn't really there the whole time. Is sort of the thought. It could just have been layered that really sort of nakedly AI. It could have been a whole separate sound layered in there and make that work, and that's absolutely fine. There's lots of things that could have inferred that. But actually, while we're here, let's look at the spectrum and sort of understand some of my decisions that I made to make the sound. Around this area is actually a pretty good place to start. There's a couple of things that we could take away from this, if you watch my brute force sound design video, this is kind of what I meant when I was talking about that. Where yeah, I know that's AI, I know it's Massive. I'm not really that familiar with Massive, so what am I gonna do to sort of elicit whatever they did to make this sound? And even if I am not familiar enough with the processes, I can still look at this and I can see, okay, there's this big hole right here. What does that really represent? And my first thought was, okay, this is just a big notch. This is kind of making that sound, and sometimes kind of that could be it, and that actually might just be it, honestly. But what I took away from this was instead of looking at the negative space and think, okay, that's just one filter, I looked at this and I thought, okay, let's do a high pass and a band pass. So a high pass coming in, cut off like this, and then a band pass coming in, cut off like that. And a big reason why I went with this is actually because I have made a sound like this. It didn't sound quite like this, but it had a lot of the same qualities that was high pass noise coming down against a band passed bass. So, and that's that kind of chompy, vocally sound that I should stop explaining sounds because we're looking at it right here. And that quality exists as a result of that configuration. So that's more or less where I started. However, there are also a bunch of other things that I have learned about Massive since the old days where I just never touched Massive at all. Fun things about what the Sine Shaper does and how the restart via gate business works, which I'm not even using because I'm also using Unison, which in Massive is actually kind of cool because you can do Unison on the wavetable as well as using on the pitch, which I'm doing an unimaginably small amount of, but mostly about the wavetable positions and on the pan. Even though I don't think the original had that much panning on it, I figured it sounded kind of cool. But yeah, let's begin at the beginning. I do kind of like I almost said the serial, which would not have been wrong. But what I meant to say is the linear nature of Massive, where like things are going where they're going, and like, you don't really need to worry about like crazy interchanging patches and that kind of stuff. And it does definitely makes it much simpler. I just usually am not all about the simplicity. So I am using the AI oscillator, and I believe if I've done this right, we will only hear it. Oh, well, yeah. There's also the part where I'm compressing the crap out of it and afterwards, but let's not mess with that. Oh, yeah, and I'm having it. There we go. Okay, that sounds right. So the way that I'm doing this is I'm using one of the macros, and I'm using this one macro to macro a whole bunch of crap. I don't necessarily think I recommend doing that. The only reason why I'm doing that is because I don't wholly understand how the performer works. Like most people who are like, they describe themselves as being like massive users, people who use massive as like their main deal, live in this thing. And a lot of the automation can be pretty cool that you can do with it. It's all automation that they can do externally. That's the problem is that like automating the macro sometimes doesn't translate into a one-to-one automation. Like for example, if I try to do really sharp automation, it wouldn't really come across as being really sharp. And that's just something that happens. But I'm using a macro just because I really don't want to mess with the performer. So yeah, AI and the wavetabling the whole freaking thing just because it just sounds that way. And I'm using the Bend Plus, which operates on the sound an awful lot like the way FM operates on the sound, which is kind of cool. And a big reason why back in the day when I first heard a sound like this, like in a Kill the Noise track or something like that, I assumed that it was FM because I had recognized the effect, though I did not know enough about like wavetable stuff to understand that there are other ways to do that. I also am modding the amplitude with the macro so that like when it goes all the way down down to the end of the automation, like it actually does cut off. Which it is not totally plain or like obvious why that's important now, but later on in the chain, once we have all the filters and distortion and that kind of stuff, the low level stuff kind of sounds messy, and cutting it off on volume means that you kind of keep that tightness, which is nice. So that's pretty neat. A big part. Oh yeah, I guess we're still using Unison. So without Unison, there we go. We got the world's most basic, massive AI kind of sound. I guess that is actually. So that's what the AI wavetable sounds like. And then with the band plus minus, we get a little bit of that FM, and then with the volume, it cuts back out and it's nice. And then I had Unison on, but we'll actually try on Unison later just because part of like the chain, I made a lot of these decisions like with the whole processing on, which is fairly common. So I don't necessarily want you to think that like I listened to this sound and thought, yes, it'll be exactly what I want. Most of these decisions I also still made with like the whole chain on, which like unless you do this sort of thing and you're doing like the same thing over and over again, you're really not going to know how some of this stuff is going to behave. And exactly, you might have like a little bit of an idea about the kind of character it'll have, but you won't really know precisely where it's going to go. Yeah. So then the modulation oscillator. So the modulation oscillator is pretty sweet because it's like a lot of like hardware synths. It's just like this secondary thing that exists to modulate other parameters. And one of the big reasons why that's cool in hardware is because it can do filter FM, which am I doing any of? I'm doing a little bit on number one here because the high pass filter. It only lets you do the FM on high pass and low pass filter, which is just a fairly common digital limitation. Except for modern stuff like the new reactor block stuff, because they can actually FM filters, at least in the blocks architecture. You can't just FM everything unless you know how to just use reactor, and you can just do it all internally, which I don't at all. But modulation oscillator exists to modulate really at audio rates. Audio rate being faster than LFO. So LFO is low frequency oscillation where it's slower, that you can't detect a tone, and then audio rate is where you can only detect a tone, you can't detect individual motion. Obviously that threshold is different for different people, but generally speaking, like you're not going to really tell what like 200 hertz is like when you're individual motion for that when you're playing it. So that's audio rate, and that's what the audio rate modulation is. Now, something that isn't totally clear in Massive and with anyone else is that when you see this phase targeting, modulating phase at audio rate is FM. If you use FM8, that's exactly the same kind of FM that is phase modulation, because digital FM is accomplished by modulating phase. Phase being the starting point of a waveform, and if you change how where the waveform is starting while it's playing, you are moving it forward or backwards in frequency, which elongates or contracts or expands the waveform, which changes its pitch. It's a Doppler effect, but in waveforms. Yeah. So that's burp exists there. It's really small, and I am also modulating it up and down with the macro. Ooh. You can hear it start to sort of affect the sound that way. And then we'll hear the filter FM when we get the actual filter on. So the first filter, I have the way that I have the filter set up is that I have I have this one oscillator going to both filters. It's set up in parallel. The mix is between the two of them. And we have the high pass and the band pass. Here's the high pass. Now, what that's doing, it's really quiet, I know, but what that's doing is that it's coming down. If we look back at the Edison section here, this is taking care of the downward motion. So it's down, back up again, that kind of thing. And you can kind of see how it cuts off right before the next hit. That's something that coming down to volume helps to do. So that's doing that. That's what the high pass is doing. And there being filter FM on that is really just that I put it there to sound cool. I also want to point out that I have the modulation oscillator set up to be 1 octave higher than the fundamental tone, which is what the oscillator one is still running at. So what that does most of the time is that it'll add square wave harmonics from FM versus saw wave harmonics from FM. However, this sound, there's a bunch of stuff about how this works that makes it a little unclear as to how it'll work out. Sometimes in many FM applications, even things that start out with saw wave harmonics, if you FM it with a particular kind of higher frequency, it'll come out with square wave harmonics. Isn't always the case, but it is most of the time the case. I haven't quite figured out how to generalize that, in terms of situations. But point being is that even though this is still at 1 octave, we are still getting plenty of saw wave harmonics. The saw wave series, the harmonic series, not necessarily literal saw waves. And then doing that on the filter and also on the actual phase of the FM up here really just gets the tone that I just like better than it being on the same octave. This is really the only reason why I did that, is that I thought maybe it'll sound better an octave higher. Oh, hey, I was right. And that's kind of what I did. And by better in this case, I mean more likely original. Who knows if that's what actually happened there. Actually, I'm more or less certain that there was some kind of notch chicanery going on with the things, because that's kind of what you do with massive, is that you use the double notch filter. I'm just not practiced in its effects. But actually, before we get to the filter, we got to talk about the insert, because I have the insert set up in the routing to be before the filter. And this is a Sine Shaper, which is all the way on wet, and then the drive is coming up. You can just see what it's doing. But what the Sine Shaper does is it's a wave shaper, and it essentially is shoving sines into an individual oscillation of whatever the waveform is. You can do this in Serum pretty easily. If you go to the linear sine fold, rather, it's folding, same kind of thing. Yeah, and it has a particular quality to it. In this case, I'm using it to kind of smooth it out a little bit. Except I have it on none because I turned it off. That was weird. Why did I do that? So it made the mids a little bit more aggressive in there, and that comes out later to matter a little bit more. And then filters. So I'll talk about the high pass, and then in there with the band pass. The band pass by itself sounds like this. And then the high pass by itself sounds like this. And then together, they sound like this. So they're complementing each other and filling up the space that they occupy. I think now's a good time to turn on the Unison. So with the Unison, I had 2 voices. I experimented with various numbers, and there's actually just very interesting things that the Unison does inside Massive. However, you don't have a whole lot of control over it. Because if you want the squelchiest, hardest squelch kind of sound out of Massive, you got to use the restart via gate to make sure stuff kind of just is where you want it to be. And then you can also manually move around where the phases of all the individual oscillators, and that can you can add them up and coalesce them in a certain way that the squelch is just better. But when the second you turn on Unison, that means that all the Unison voices, including with the pitch change, all still start in the same phase, which has a sound that's not super great for this particular application. And you don't have controls in a way to be able to separate the two concepts. So we have to sort of deal with that. And I dealt with that by just not having phase control, and it kind of worked out okay, just because the resulting sound does have that squelch in there, but it's not like X-Core squelch. If you ever heard any of the older like X-Core songs, where like it has like the maximum amount of squelch possible out of massive, that kind of stuff. Might have had some Unison involved, but that guy knew a lot more about massive than I do. Yeah. So Unison's on, and it kind of convolutes the sound even more. Like most of what we're doing before the distortion is that we're just sort of doing stuff that convolutes the sound in a certain way, so that when we turn on distortion, it works. At least it sort of behaves in the way that's pleasurable to our faces. I'm modulating the wet dry and also the drive amount, and this is just sort of like modulating distortion is good to create sort of character control, just because like unchained distortion and like unchained volume control, because that's also another form of distortion control. It's like how loud a signal is going into distortion will change how the properties of it being distorted. Like for example, if I didn't have any of the control on there, we just control it and it's good. I feel like part of my Unison screwed up. Did I turn this on by accident? No, I didn't. Weird. I don't have anything on effects 2, I don't believe, but I did have the EQ on, and I'm using the boot, like the middle frequency. Actually, if you want to look at what an actual parametric EQ is, this is basically it. A parametric EQ is one where you have like you control the parameters of individual bands, and in this case, there's a high shelf and a low shelf, and then the parametric in the middle. Like you have like the frequency it's at, and then plus or minus gain, and then that's how parametric EQ works. Like hardware parametric EQs are pretty much this. Like you might see them on particularly advanced like mixing consoles, where you'll see, okay, here's the midband, and then here's the knob that's also the frequency of the midband. Less feature developed consoles will have just high and low kind of thing. The parametric EQ that exists inside FL, that is just like this guy. This is still a parametric EQ because it has like the volume, the gain, like the frequency, and then plus or minus the gain, and then it also has bandwidth, which the guy in Massive doesn't. And there's just a lot of them, and you might confuse this for a graphic EQ because there are graphics and you can see it and it's visual, but an actual graphic EQ doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have any kind of frequency or bandwidth changes. It just has volume. However, there's like 30 of them. And so that means that you like essentially are drawing the curve with the individual things themselves. And that's in case that was ever a thing you were wondering about. Yeah. The problem with not having the gate on is that it's also randomized. Like when things start is different every single time, and it's a little annoying for me personally, just because I couldn't figure out a way around that. But I have it EQ'd. I just EQ I'm using. I'm getting rid of some of those really obnoxious sort of higher frequencies, which really weren't apparent until I started compressing it. And in the compressor, I basically was just sort of pretending I was using OTT and just like multi-banded, crushed everything, and then crushed everything into a limit. And so those annoying high frequencies that kind of clashed off a little bit in there, and that sort of made it feel a little bit better. And I'm really hoping I'm not forgetting something. So we have oscillator, modulation, oscillator. Oh yeah, I had this on in the filter FM, which does almost nothing. And it's really only affecting the high pass, and the high pass isn't really moving that far, and it also doesn't have a lot of resonance, which are a whole bunch of things which wouldn't really mean we could even hear what the FM is doing. And that's a lot of fun. That's pretty much the sound. Like this. I mean, like I said, I didn't like do the whole notch thing, which is a big part of using Massive, especially for this style of sound, this kind of like 2013-ish Kill the Noise kind of thing. Zomboy, all those guys, the bro steppy sound. That's definitely this whole thing, and they all did that with the double notch filter. It's worth noting that like the double notch filter inside Massive doesn't have as much control. I mean, a lot about Massive doesn't have as much control as what Serum does. And really, if I were going to be modern about it, I would use Serum. And a lot of the problems and a lot of things me about not having the kind of control I was describing about would be solved by using Serum. And the whole reason I'm using Massive is because it has the AI wavetable, which was extremely clearly used in the sound. If I were a little bit more industrious, I could have probably gone and found someone who had an AI wavetable and used that. Like the Massive wavetables are all out there, and you can just use them in Serum. Or I could have just recorded myself and made it into a table. But I wanted to see if I could actually get Massive to do this, because I have tried in the past to do sounds like this, and I just didn't get anywhere near it. I didn't totally nail it this time either, but I got a lot closer than usual, and I feel nice about that. So that's kind of fun. Yeah, so I will put up this entire FLP to download. It's worth, this is 12.3 that I'm using right now, so if you're using older versions, you might have a harder time with that. I guess I'll also put out this preset. I think, do I care enough? Like, how different does it sound without? Yeah, whatever, I'll just put out the preset. This is just murder it with compression is all that's happening here. I've thought almost nothing about what's happening. I turned the release time down on the mids because I wanted to be tighter, but that's it. And everything else, and like I turned it down on the master also for the same reason, to be tighter. But like almost nothing is happening in here, and in here there's just a little bit of stuff, but not a whole lot. All the fun stuff is going on inside Massive, so I just put this up as a preset, and you can download that. Yeah. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. If you'd like to make a request for any kind of sound design, make sure you make a comment in the video. And I actually remember what I wanted to say in the beginning, which was that you comment the song and you comment a timestamp, like the time in the song that it happens. Oh boy, I really should have said that in the beginning. Whatever, I'll fix that the next when I do the next K video. Infinity K, yeah. And also remember to make the comment on whatever the most current Infinity K video is. There will be a playlist, and I will keep up the playlist. I will keep it up. Unlike the other ones where I just kind of let it go, because this is kind of important now. So I will actually keep up when, you know, the playlist, so that you know which the latest video is. Make your comment with a video or SoundCloud, really anywhere, like just somewhere online that the song exists, with a timestamp of when the sound occurs. Don't try to explain to me the sound. Don't try to describe. Don't just say like the artist and the sound at the drop, but give me an example. That's what I want. Anything less will be ignored. Yeah. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that fun stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.